The Daniel 3 Podcast, Episode 9. Hi, this is Jacob with the Daniel 3 Podcast. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to welcome back Joe Hartman. Joe, how are you doing tonight?
Good, Jacob. Good to be here.
Good, glad to have you. For those who didn't watch it or who aren't familiar with Joe, Joe is part of the Libertarian Party and Mises Caucus, and he was running for office back this last November. I didn't actually ask, but I kind of assume you didn't win, right? I never actually followed up to see what your results were in the. What were you running for again? I don't even remember what your position you're running for was.
Yeah, so I didn't like to say I was running for office. I said I was on the ballot, because my name was on the ballot, and I got 7,897 votes to be a congressperson.
Okay.
I ran against Alyssa Slotkin, Michigan 8th District, and it was kind of fun at times. It was also seemingly pointless at other times. But overall, it was a good experience. It got me more involved with Libertarian Party, and I got to have conversations that were, enjoyable and interesting, like the one that we had a few months ago. And so, I'm not considering doing that again anytime soon, but I think for people who are looking to get involved, it's a fun little activity. And especially if there's a vacant spot where there's no libertarian on the ballot, it's something that I would encourage people to do to some degree. So,
right. Do you feel like after what would you say after going through that process, maybe a positive thing was for you personally? You were talking about that last time, how it was, you were contrasting it with things you had done in the past, and from a standpoint of personal growth, what was that process like, and how did it take you out of your comfort zone? And that was your first time doing anything majorly into the realm of politics, right?
Yes. Yeah. I would say the biggest consequence of it, and I don't know if we've talked about this at all, but I through someone I spoke to during the campaign in the local area, they reached out to me and encouraged me to seek the open position on the Village of Pinckney Planning Commission. So I'm on the planning commission of my little local village now. They appointed me, and they were happy to have someone, just be a part of the program, I guess. And so anyway, it's been an interesting experience. And one of the main issues has been about the cannabis licensing. So I've gotten to, read. I haven't had much of a input on anything much. Planning commission is just kind of overseas. But I am, actually in government now, but it's on a local level. And, I got to support rezoning of a potential, call it an old building to be maybe used for a better purpose. We also approved a community garden. So they're going to use some of the money that they took from taxpayers. And instead of, putting it to more frivolous things, actually, go towards something that grows produce.
Yeah, but what you didn't do was you didn't end the daylight savings. So we're still
not yet. Yes, that was my absolutely. That was a huge push of my campaign. I tried to mention it everywhere, and there's a lot of momentum. My Twitter feed is full of me retweeting and talking about and trying to promote the idea of locking the clock. I appreciate you bringing that up. It's a crucial issue. We want to make this year the final killer clock change. So if this is something that you want to save lives and oppose government power, it's a great issue. And I think it's one of the reasons why one of the reasons why I thought it was a good issue to talk about is because, for one, it's an abuse of government power and it kills people. So that's bad. But it's also something where there's actually momentum. In so many times as a libertarian, we look at the political system and it's unfixable. Or maybe we trim around the edges, but it's growing way faster than we could ever slow down. And it's this runaway freight train. But there's people who are, wrong on lots of other issues, but they think that changing the clocks around is a really bad idea. So Marco Rubio has been one that's pushing the bill. And there are the bill in the House has 8 co-sponsors. The new bill right now only has 8, but the one from last Congress had 21. There are more people, and this is the time of year to pay attention to it. This is the only time people care. And, as, a parent of younger children, it really throws them off, having that weird, day, losing the hour of sleep is a problem. So, yeah, it's an issue that I have not, I don't think I've made any, contribution to raising awareness about it, other than the few people that, uh, heard me on
Well, yeah,
some campaign.
you
But
raised
yeah,
awareness to me. I didn't realize there was a big movement to end that before I had talked to you, and now I pay a bit
yeah.
more attention to it. And
Well, it's an international movement too.
right,
The daylight savings, or like the clock switch, is in the end of March for Europe, and there was a discussion in 2019 about ending it in Europe, but they just couldn't schedule the meetings to actually do it. So they've delayed it for 18 months now, and I guess they have to study it more. I don't know what there is to study, but it's one of those things that uh with politics, stoking up fear, getting people mad about something is the way to win. And just maybe if we can piss off enough people this year about it, and get people to contact legislators or just raise the awareness about it, I don't know. I'm optimistic though. I really am. I really think that this could be the last year that we have to endure it. So I gotta say, and Scott Yates, I've mentioned his name before, but his blog tracks everything, and he's in contact with all the state legislators. So check out his stuff, promote his stuff. He's not a libertarian, but whatever, he's libertarian on this issue. So
right.
that's a great thing. Yes.
Yeah, and issue coalitions are important if you're going to be doing politics. So you have to be able to, work with candidates and groups that aren't strictly libertarian. And that is one of the things that the Mises Caucus, which we are both a part of, focuses on. I know that might be surprising for some people who follow my podcast to hear that I say that I'm actually part of the the Mises Caucus now. I'd always kind of, from abroad, kind of like been not really involved, but like supported them, gave them shout outs, and always liked what they were about. And back a couple months ago, Luke, Mike, and a couple others approached me about just helping to moderate the Facebook group, as far as like they just needed more bodies to help approve posts, to monitor the inflow of new members, and go through the onboarding process. There's talks about perhaps me being a state coordinator down the road, which I'm not, still trying to figure out how much time I can give to it. But I really like what the Mises Caucus is about. When did you like join the caucus, or did you start becoming affiliated with it during your political run, or were you involved before then? I can't remember.
Yeah. So I'm not sure when exactly I knew that the Mises Caucus existed. Um, on some level, I joined the Libertarian Party affiliate in my county, in Livingston County, Michigan, just to make some connections and meet some fellow libertarians. And I found out that there were some kind of famous libertarians in the area, with slightly different views than mine, and slightly different than the Mises Caucus. But I didn't have much interest in being involved with the party on a larger level until the Mises Caucus and Spike Cohen. To me, like the fact that Spike got onto the ticket, saying the stuff that he does, being as radical and principled as he is, that was a big deal to me. And to see him, instead of Bill Weld, like just the Libertarian Party going in that direction, was like, okay, this is something I could be a part of. And then at the convention, a month or so later, or I guess before the convention, when I brought up the idea of just kind of wondering who was running for Congress, and the fact that no one was, is when the idea became more appealing to me, just as a part of trying to make the Libertarian Party brand more like my type of libertarianism, which is certainly Mises and Praxeology and Rothbard and Tom Woods and all of these wonderful philosophers and people with just excellent contributions to libertarian thought and theory. And I attempted to talk to anyone who would listen to me and was interested in having a dialogue. So in terms of the Mises Caucus, getting a bigger part of it, I've been a part of the state organization since the 2020 part. I met some of those other Michigan members in 2018 at the state convention that I went to in 2018. I wasn't a delegate at that convention. I just showed up to meet people because I was from Florida and I had just moved up here to try to connect with some libertarian types. And anyway, so I don't know I mean, the Mises Caucus is blown up, and I'm curious. I don't know. I don't follow all of the controversy. I don't really know. I do often get the bad side of the story. Like I hear the critique of the Mises Caucus stuff from some of my fellow members in the county party, but none of that ever resonates with anything I've ever seen. The people in the leadership that I've interacted with have been excellent, hardworking people who share the same goals that I do. So.
Yeah, and I really love the idea of, well, there's two things I love, and these were like part of what compelled me to kind of move from my position kind of on the fence to kind of, now being, in the outfield playing ball with them. And for one, I really love the messaging and like the fact that their name is the Mises Caucus, that their slogan is "Take Human Action." I mean, just the more of those ideas, the more that Austrian economics is put out there for people to have to engage in, put into social media and the mainstream culture, I think is important, because for me, economics isn't just like some nerdy pastime hobby for me. Like I think economics and more important, praxeology and human action are just like, they are fundamental ways to view life and to orient yourself around, as far as like, realizing that you have to act, that you have no choice but to act, and you should be maximizing your potential by setting goals for yourself and being inspired to do something, not to just act without intention, or to act like just sort of like just being like a casual agent, just reacting without really like a focus, but rather to be inspired to take control of your life and to orient it around something. And also I think Austrian economics are important to kind of push back against the ever-growing reliance on the state, and the ever-growing just kind of like the views that you see in our society and culture today regarding politics and the goals that we want to do. I mean, especially after the COVID lockdowns and everything going on there, like it's just, politics are just more in the mainstream than ever before. And, we need more voices out there speaking out against centrally planned society. And, to me, the Mises Caucus is just an effective force on that front. And I think that there is utility in having something like a force like that that's in the political arena. As much as I hate politics, I mean, I'm an anarchist philosophically. I would love to see the state end. That's my ideal society, is one with no state and no politics. But the two things that are in my mind is that, one, I don't want to live based upon the nirvana fallacy. I don't want to just like, well, my ideal society is without a state, so therefore I will not engage in anything that is involving the state. It's like, well, for one, that's really hard to do, like to go through life and avoid the state. They kind of make it hard for you to do that without being like a hermit hiding out in the mountains or something. And B, it's just, as much as I want politics to end, I know that A, that might never happen, and B, if it does happen, we have to get people used to that idea. We have to start like, it's not going to happen just because people don't engage with it, in my opinion. To me, we have to engage in what the true culture war is. Like, people use that term, the culture war, like it's about the right versus left. And to me, the real underlying culture war, the one that actually matters, is those who value freedom and those who are either, I mean, there's some people that just aren't participating because they're agnostic, but there are people that are, heavily enthralled by the idea of a state, by the idea of centrally planning things, of creating positive rights and positive, mechanisms of coercion in society. And, a lot of people are just going to pay attention to the political arena. So like, I can put a podcast out there, and we already have tons of, we have people, we have Rothbard out there and tons of anarchist writing, but if people aren't looking for it, they're not going to find it. You know what I mean? Like, so there has to be some kind of voice for liberty in the political realm. And that was Ron Paul for a while. But he was just one guy. And to me, the Mises Caucus is, I made a post in the Facebook group a couple weeks ago, and I was like, you know, the Mises Caucus is the new Ron Paul movement, but instead of it being focused around one guy, it's all of us. It is, we all can be like Ron Paul, and from different stages of life, and different areas, enter the political arena. And you know, it's not about like one of the straw man arguments you hear from like the anarchists who don't like political involvement, and I sympathize with them, but they're like, well, you're just asking for freedom. It's like, I don't know if you've ever watched what we do. It's not about asking. Like, we're pretty, like, you know, the way I describe it is like, I'm pissed off for freedom. I'm pissed off at statism. And I view what the Mises Caucus is doing as people going into the system, and they're like Ron Paul. They're saying, no, screw this. This is wrong. This is evil. You know, we should stop bombing children. We should stop selling off our children and grandchildren into insurmountable debt that they'll never be able to overcome. You know, these things are horrible, and they need to stop. So, you know, that's what got me really fired up to join, and has continued to inspire me since I joined. You know, I don't know what your observations are or responses to that.
Yeah, no, other than, and the fact that you said something about how we could all be Ron Paul, like there's only one Ron Paul, and that's like the legend. And really, you know, so many people around our age were inspired and were brought to, you know, this ideology from Dr. Paul. And I do think that, you know, I have no idea how big of an impact the Mises Caucus has generally. I know that the people that I have associated with have really encouraged me and made me just excited to have them as friends, and to have the discussions, and to have people who are, you know, like you said, just as mad and you know, pissed off and ready to try to do stuff to make change. But I guess my perception is that the biggest part of the change has been within the Libertarian Party, and has been trying to mold the Libertarian Party into a true, you know, like viable option that people can look at and have interest in, right? And have messaging that is strong. And we've been given a huge opportunity with the failure of the politicians and the lockdown state and all this crazy stuff that has happened. And one of the, you know, things I should have hit harder and more consistently and louder was my opposition to the lockdowns during the congressional campaign. I just, so few people were skeptical of it that I didn't get much traction. At least were willing to say, you know, openly that they were skeptical of it. They just kind of went along with it. At least so many of the people I interacted with, and it just seemed like the kind of thing that you know, one of my thoughts was that it isn't something that should be decided by federal Congress anyway. So maybe it would be less relevant for me to talk for that reason. But I think, you know, generally we can, you know, try to fit our message to different groups of people in different ways. And that's one of the things that I think the Libertarian Party has struggled to do, is to have like so my sense is that the branding of it, the sort of like outreach, is targeted towards more like moderate people who are kind of annoyed by Democrats and Republicans, right? Who would probably vote for one or the other, but instead maybe they'll vote for the third party this time. But it's like, instead, we need to be targeting those people who have no interest in the system, who are disgusted by Democrats and Republicans, and many of whom may also have some pretty crazy ideas, or some different ideas, where they, you know, they recognize they hate the state, right? In terms of that litmus test, do you hate the state? They hate the state, and they realize that the government is a source of a lot of the problems. But they just may also have some other, you know, kind of out there ideas, which on some level really opposing the state. Like, to me, like I think Social Security is a horrific, insanely like terrible, insidious system that is like just absolutely, you know, just terrible. Like it's the worst thing. It destroys people. It you know, makes income inequality so much worse. It entrenches like, you know, wealth inequality. It's an example of systemic racism. Like, it's a terrible, horrific policy. But most people are perfectly fine with it, and they think it's a good thing. It's actually very popular. And to me, like, that's horrible. Like, that's disgusting. But it would be, you know, very ineffective for me to try to go, you know, preach how bad Social Security is to people, even if I could put it into a compelling message it wouldn't work, right? Because people have their interests bound up in it, and they're used to it. So I think when we have the opportunity, like lockdowns, like whatever other government overreaches like are more obvious, like we talked about before with daylight savings time stuff. It's like when we have these obvious examples, we can use that as a way of getting people's attention and helping them reframe the issue, not about like which politicians should be in charge or who should be making these decisions, but about decentralization, right? And decentralization, decriminalization. The Mises Caucus is radical on those fronts, and I think that's just awesome. And I'm happy to be a part of it. It's hard to imagine like what it could look like in a few years. That's one thing that I have no sense of what the Mises Caucus could look like by 2024. I feel like it could be a massive force. It could be slightly larger than it is now. I feel like we're having lots of growth. I know our Michigan group has been growing. So yeah, I mean, I'm excited about that. But I think finding the right people to be in the leadership, like to me, I think Spike is great. I had a fun conversation with him a few weeks ago on his show, talking about being appointed to the Planning Commission as a libertarian winning an election, which I didn't win anything really. I just got appointed, but hey, I got into office from running an election, so that was the point of the story. But I think like someone like him who has a clear message, a strong radical and principled message, that we need more Spikes out there making more noise. So yeah, and the Mises Caucus, supporting people like him and others having bigger and bigger roles in the LP is a definite win. So,
and that is an important other point of this is the and some people like the Mises Caucus, a lot of the leadership have phrased it as it is a takeover, which has been controversial to some.
Yeah, to me, I think we should call it Build Back Better. Like the Biden thing, right? That's what the Mises Caucus is trying to do. Yeah.
I remember when you said that a while back. I was like, that's awesome. That would be the ultimate trolling message to make.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the LP is an important part of this too, because as much as the Mises Caucus is growing, it still doesn't have the name recognition that the Libertarian Party does, and it is the biggest political party outside the duopoly in the country. And so having the Libertarian Party be principled in its message is important. I'm still pretty agnostic or skeptical about political action as far as like a means to freedom. Like, I don't think that winning elections is the equation to or the formula to getting to liberty so much. But I do think that using the Libertarian Party as a Angela McArdle put it this way in one of her interviews. She's like, it should be like a shit talking prophet that just literally just spends all of its time blasting liberty and pointing out all the bad ways in which the status policies that are being enacted or that are being enforced are going to result in destruction of people's lives and wealth and property and their happiness and the erosion of their freedoms. And the Libertarian Party should have been louder than anyone in condemning the lockdowns and condemning what's happened in 2020. And we could barely get the party to tweet out a couple lukewarm statements about what the state did. Even if the lockdowns end, like even if they relinquish their control over these things, they're not going to forget how easy it was to implement that kind of control. And now it's like, because this isn't me making a statement about COVID. Like, I'm not one of those people that is out there saying COVID is a hoax. COVID is not a big deal. I mean, I had COVID. It sucked. Like, I have asthma. So it really rocked me. I mean, I was lucky I didn't have to be hospitalized. I was very close to asking my wife to drive me to the hospital while I had COVID. Because it was so incredibly hard to breathe. So this is not about denying the science, not about denying the seriousness of COVID as far as like, now, I mean, on the same token, I think there was a lot of fear mongering and a lot of pushing, making things seem as worse as as bad as possible in the media and trying to stir up fear, which I don't think is helpful. But this isn't about denying the science or saying that, I felt like there aren't responsible measures that people should take and that the market could take towards COVID and pandemics. But this is about the state forcing these things on people at what and how does the state do it? At the point of a gun. And we literally saw the state, and police officers like handcuffing parents who were just trying to take their kids to the park. And I mean, that is just surreal. Like, I never thought in America I would see police officers arresting parents for taking their kids to the park. Like, that is just ridiculous. And the Libertarian Party, we could barely get them to come out and say, oh yeah, this is bad. It's like they just were too reluctant to say it because it was unpopular. But like, you know what? If you're too concerned about, sucking up and looking respectable to the political establishment, well then why do you exist? It's like, if you're too afraid to actually stand up and speak out against the existing establishment for liberty, then why call yourself the Libertarian Party? It just doesn't make sense to me. And so that's why I'm okay with the idea of the Mises Caucus building back better or taking over or whatever you want to call it, because the Libertarian Party should be more libertarian. And between those two things, the Mises Caucus, the internal politics of the LP, and then the outward mission into the world, I just think that it's it's not the end all be all. Like, I'm not going to devote 100% of my time here, but I'll be damned if I am not. I think division of labor applies to not just people doing different things, but just also in our own lives. We don't necessarily have to focus on one thing, and there's lots of things I do, and I just figured, if I have extra time and resources to devote to this, I think this is, like, if I'm hedging my bets and trying to do things that are productive for liberty, I just can't justify not having at least somewhat of a hand involved in this. So that's why I've gotten more involved. And, part of that was me thinking about these things in the terms of praxeology and trying to figure out, what is the best use of my time and resources. And, I was like, well, what else can I do? Like, I'm one person, like, I have a podcast. I can go out there and engage people on social media, but I'm just one person versus joining a group of people who are like-minded. And, doing that, I think we can be more effective. And so, I think there's a praxeological, argument to be made there. Although I didn't flesh it out in my head that way, but I was thinking in those, that is what motivated my thinking, was that, like, I want, my goal was, like, I'm uneasy with what's going on around me, and I want to do what I can as an individual to fight for liberty. And what are my best avenues of doing that?
Yeah, I think there's always a variety, an infinite variety, really, of different ways that you can look at opportunities to both fulfill your need to contribute and to do something, right? The need to act. And when you're talking, you described praxeology earlier. You're talking about it in the sense of what people should do, right? And that we can see ourselves as a human who acts and has responsibilities and finds ways to use yourself as a means in pursuit of higher goals. And I think that's not always the way that praxeology is usually talked about, where it's just a descriptive sense of the fact that we do act, creates this incentive structure. And when you see that, when you have that way of looking at the world and recognizing what different groups' incentives are, and in the economics in one lesson sense, where with the discussion of how different economic groups and so, like, but looking at where you want to contribute and try to add value to a certain group or to a certain purpose, there it is. Yeah. That's one. And so, like, being able to be a part of the Mises Caucus and have really, at least for me, I've no inhibition about being a part of the group. And like I said, there are people in the group that I don't know very well that probably have said things that I certainly don't agree with, but whatever, who cares? That's the way it is with every single group of people. And I'm certain that anybody in the Mises Caucus, right, has much, to me, much more peaceful and more ethical views than Pete Buttigieg or Tom Cotton or something, right? Like it's not even close, because these people have the view of that dichotomy, like you're talking about, of liberty versus power, in which Rothbard always writes about, where it's that's where the tension is. And I think that too often the discussion gets reduced down into like people, like groups of people that are fighting for authoritarianism, or like we call them statists, and we use all of our libertarian lingo, but it doesn't really connect with the way that they're describing, because like progressives see their policies as increasing freedom. Like they use that kind of language a lot of times, right? And there's the line about like injustice anywhere. Injustice anywhere means, wait, I don't know, something like injustice anywhere means justice cannot, I don't know. There's one of the phrases, I don't even know what it is, but it's one of those things where, yeah, you know what I'm talking about? Oh, it's bugging me now. But it's an idea that has some truth to it, but at the same time, it can be used as a hammer, to say like, if you don't care about this group of marginalized people and want to have law enforcement change the rules up on them, then you don't care about them and you're supporting injustice. And it's like actually the opposite argument, where our goal is to increase the agency and the freedom of individuals. Yeah.
Right. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
There it is. Yeah. That's what I was looking for. Yes.
Yeah, I was like, I knew what you were talking about, but I was like,
I couldn't get there. Yes, is the threat. That was the word I was missing. Is the threat to justice everywhere. And I think like sure, there's definitely some truth to that, but it's like that can't be the determining factor of whether a policy is justified, just because it, in some people's perspective, stops one version of injustice if it spreads injustice to other groups. And that's where that the abuse of political power, there's so few people fighting against it, and the Mises Caucus has a strong message against it. So that's, to me.
Well, and it's like people will sometimes be very, we talked about this last time, like people have a hard time getting sold on Austrian economics, because Austrian economics kind of does boil down everything to private property, in a sense. You got people who are self-owners acting in their own self-interest and making transactions in the market based upon their own subjective values. And when it comes to viewing things in that way and understanding scarcity and understanding how economies work, people will accuse libertarians of our persuasion of kind of like a callousness. It's like, oh, well, why are you so focused on property rights when like there's people starving? Like, I don't care about, not violating property rights. Like to them, it's like, that's just, they're so driven by their empathy for, and I get that. Like I totally get that, being so driven by your empathy that you focus on, well, there's people starving and there's people without jobs and people without healthcare. And you're like, we need to give people what they need. And like, I so understand that I used to be that way. I mean, in 2015, I supported Bernie Sanders. Like I was driven by that until, Joe's like, oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then I was challenged by different libertarian voices I encountered to be like, okay, yes, we care about people, but let's figure out like, what are the consequences of these courses of action? What are the consequences of having these particular worldviews and systems that you want to impose? Not just short term, but long term. How do these things play out? What are we gaining as a consequence? And the difference between that worldview and like the one I have now is that while my world, like while now it might seem to people that I'm not driven by empathy, I still do have great empathy. I just know that we can't it's like it's like we have to be I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this. It's kind of like the metaphor of the airplane, where it's like you have to put your mask on before you put other people's mask on during like a crash. Um, well,
Yeah,
we can't be so driven by empathy that we don't realize the long-term consequences. Because if we focus on empathy in the short term, sure, we might help some people, but if that causes long-term suffering, that's just not a good course of action. We need to figure
sure.
out what has the best long-term uh, benefits for people's well-being and ability to have all the freedom that we want them to have, not economic freedom, social freedom, the ability to be healthy, the ability to freely travel, like all these things that we want. We can't get there just because we impose those things through the monopolistic power of the state, creating positive rights, as opposed to positive rights, for those who don't know, meaning that it's something that you're entitled to, that you can demand people provide for you, as opposed to negative rights, which are things that I merely it requires people to not act. So like a negative right being my right to self-ownership, like you can't aggress against me. This is sometimes just explained by described as the non-aggression principle, meaning you can't initiate force against people. So it's tough, and this is where something I think this can tie into what we wanted one of the subjects we wanted to talk about, which is argumentation ethics, which I think is a good way to get into praxeology and Austrian economics, and to kind of understand these things, or at least it's a good it's one good argument to get there, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think argumentation ethics is fun. It basically means like you can't argue and be a statist, or you're just self-contradicting.
Right.
Like that's really what it boils down to. At least my understanding of it. That's the basic premise. And I think like just to go over, my like approach to praxeology is just that the idea, it all starts with the action axiom. The idea human action is purposeful, and that describes praxis. And then the logos is the study of that. So the ology, being the study of human action, and just a simple. So we just logically deduce the idea. Okay, so if human action is purposeful, well, that action, is about using means in pursuit of ends. And so one of the things that is misunderstood, and one of the things I enjoy kind of, or at least I used to, is seeing things like praxeology debunked. And then you read it and it's like, well, the person doesn't really understand, like, because the way that Mises describes, and it's early in human action, where there's a big section about how all human action is rational according to the way that he describes rational. Like it's impossible to act in a way that you don't choose to. Like, and so even if you're like Jesus, right? Like, so the story of Jesus, he was still doing what he wanted to. At any point he could have, punched a guard in the face, or he could have, like resisted or something, but he, always acted according to his own interest. If someone is, like the story of Spartacus acting against his slave masters. It's the same sort of thing. Like all of the other slaves were doing what they wanted to, and he did what he wanted to. But it's like, but it's the phrasing a lot of times when you try to describe like the difference, it's like too simplistic. It's like when you try to say people do what they want, it's like Hartman from South Park, like, I do what I want. And so I think, with that, the simple idea that people will do what they want, right, is the argument against political hierarchy. Because if you give people the power to do what they want, and you create these incentive structures that punish people for being adaptive and responsive and coming up for good ideas, and they incentivize, like, it is so shocking to me, and it shouldn't be, but it's still shocking to me that Biden won and that Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. Like, how in the hell did that still happen? It's so crazy. And like when people look back at our society during these years, they're going to be like, wow, this guy was president. And then they're going to be like, and then they got Biden. And like, they're going to watch these videos of these people who are leading the country, right? Who are the Democratic rulers or whatever. And it's just going to be shocking. Like, I'm convinced. Like, you know how, if you ever seen like a video of Hitler and he's all like yelling and like waving his arms, it's like, God, what the hell is wrong with those people? How could they embrace? That's what they're going to look back at our leaders like. These people that, have this, Scott Horton's been really blowing up talking about like the blood-soaked country and how, it's just so terrible what the U.S. military system or the U.S. military industrial complex does all across the world. And I think like, so many people in our country are just passively whatever about it. They're happy to, take their $1,400 stimmy and, just go along with it. And I think, yeah, anyway, so in terms of the complacency that comes from these government programs as well, is it fits right into that incentive structure of praxeology, where there's something empowering about like desperation and self-sufficiency. And like, when you're kind of stuck on your own, you realize that you have to do stuff. And I think, there's just the political system robs people of that self-sufficiency, of that, intentionality. It fills the gap for them and provides, and I think, there's a place in America where people have guaranteed housing and healthcare. There are lots of places all around the country where American citizens are provided with free housing and free healthcare, and it's called prison. So there's millions of people, right? Or if you're over 65, but it's true. And it's,
I totally did not see that coming.
I wasn't sure if you knew where I was going with that, but
I was like,
that's
yeah,
the way it is.
I was like Section 8 housing. I thought you were being hyperbolic.
I'm saying like descriptively, like literally,
you're right.
It's true. And I think, and plus, but it's not free by any sense, right? Like the government pays tens of thousands of dollars. It's free. Insane. No, well, there's always a cost, and there's always a use of means, right? And so those means are at a cost. And I think that when people, like, to me, the big the dichotomy between means and ends is about like how the individual sees yourself, right? You're always going to be a part of your ends. The more people you include in your ends, the more joy you get from succeeding in the pursuit of your ends, right? The more people you're able to serve or, provide something to or connect with. And then on the other side of it, if you see yourself as a means, you can see that as an opportunity, or you can see yourself as a victim of having to do, just to survive, right? Like, and it's real, like both, there is a tension there. But I think like the more that you're able to kind of look at, to recognize the idea that we're students of our actions. So just keeping that humble, curious approach as students need to be successful. And, thinking about it in that sense, and then recognizing that the pursuit of ends, it's up to you. You can value things however you want. And yeah. So, argumentation ethics. Yeah, I kind of forgot about that one. Yeah, but anyway, I basically already summarized argumentation ethics, because that's literally what it boils down to, is that idea that by, an argument in and of itself, right? So if we were to argue about something or have an argument, that you recognize by having that argument that the two individuals are capable of holding different ideas. And so in that fact of arguing and trying to change their mind, right, in the nature of argument, trying to come to a synthesis, like either find a common point of agreement or, really parse out and fine tune and see exactly where the point of disagreement is, like that process inherently acknowledges that the people have, that you and the other person you're arguing with have a different perspective, that you're both capable of having your own set of subjective value hierarchy. Right. So it's like, that's the point, that it happens in an argument. Right. And so at that point, you can recognize, okay, yes, I know this person has a different idea than me, and argue. And in that sense, you are acknowledging that arguing is better than violence. Right. Because the idea of allowing their idea to go on without, changing your mind, it's like that acknowledgement means that if you also support state violence, then in that sense, you're not acknowledging that person's inherent nature, and not like in a right sense, but like that it is their nature, that they have their own set of ideas. And so advocating for state violence or other forms of socialism or whatever else, that violates that fundamental premise that is arguing. And I think that the people who are the most authoritarian or censorious or intolerant are also really, really bad at arguing. Right. A lot of times you'll see that, where instead of coming up with like a viable argument to someone who's, makes a point they disagree with, they go to ad hominems or other, fallacious arguments. So that's, I think there's something about, Yeah. Well, it's like, for exactly. And it's like, I have plenty of disagreement with Ben Shapiro, right? But to me,
Right.
like, he will argue and he will put a
Right.
fairly decent, straightforward argument against whoever he disagrees with. So I think there's a difference compared to someone else who will take a horrible straw man or, start calling people racist or whatever else. You know what I mean? Like that. Yeah. To me, like, arguing is ethical.
Right. I love the way you put it. That's really good way to put it. Anytime you argue, you are conceding that argument is better than violence. And if you concede that, then you can't be consistent and be a statist.
Well, I think, but also, and just also within that, they also acknowledge that the argument is worth it, right? Like, you
Right.
could just ignore the other person and be like, yeah, that's their idea. And so you're kind of also acknowledging that their ideas matter, right? By going through the process of argument, you're saying that you're acknowledging that their ideas matter, or you wouldn't use your own, time and whatever method of communication to have that argument, to engage in that argument. So and I think social media is like a bad version of that a lot of times, because the ethics of the argument get lost in the back and forth and the time lapse, the gap between the messages. And, it becomes more of like a showing off to the broader audience than it is actually an intent to change someone's mind or to communicate your point as clearly as possible. So
Right. Yeah. The social media grandstanding.
yes. Yeah,
happens
exactly. Virtue
happens a
signaling,
lot.
right? The
Right.
virtue signaling. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. No, I agree. And yeah, the way I first heard uh, argumentation ethics described to me was like, you cannot argue against the premise of self-ownership and private property without explicitly and implicitly demonstrating that you agree and recognize self-ownership and private property. Because if you reject self-ownership and private property, how can you have an argument with someone? How can you recognize someone as a sentient being who is responsible for their actions and their words and their arguments, and expect them to treat you in the same way? Like it just throws the idea of statism out the window. Although it creates that foundation of really challenging the idea of using coercion and force to push ideas. And it's very similar to that slogan, like, what good ideas don't require force. It's very similar to that slogan, which is like, the minute it's kind of like you said this the last time. It's like, why would you want to be offended? Like, because like being offended is almost like a sign of like you lost. And it's like, and it's kind of like the same thing applies to like relying on violence and force. It's like the minute you are offended and then you retreat back to ad hominem, or you retreat back to using some kind of force or violence, well, you admit that you have lost the ethical argument. You admit that you have lost the moral high ground. And I mean, it's different if you're responding to someone who's someone initiates force against you. Well, now you're just acting defensively. But the minute someone escalates from words to violence, they're conceding.
Well, yeah, and I think there's, I don't want to try to like misuse the word aggression, but I do think that there's an opportunity to apply the NAP, right? To apply a principle of non-aggression to communication, where if you're out there in bad faith arguments and you're not, trying to be as, because like, to me, it's either you're trying to understand the other person or you're trying to use them, right, as a means for your own virtue signaling or to make yourself feel better. And I think, if with the way that we just described arguments, a sort of normie person or whatever would think, well, Democrats and Republicans argue, but it's like, not really. No. You know what I mean? Like that's there's no like substantive. I guess there are some substantive policy discussions here and there about, like which version of a certain bill should pass, or like kind of, within a narrow, at least what we would consider a narrow range of options, there's a little bit of discussion, but there's not a sort of like, an actual like discussion about ethics or, like ideology. Right. And applying.
They're arguing over how fast to drive towards the cliff that they're that we're driving towards. One says, can we go cruise control in the right lane? And the other side goes, no, 85 in the left lane all the way.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of like they imagine they're driving a bus, and it's like, which passengers do they care about the most? And which ones are they most able to just abuse?
Well, it's all
which
a show.
one can they get away with? Sure.
It's all a show too. Like, I don't know if you saw, did you see the Michael Malice interview with Justin Amash? That was a good one.
I meant to watch it, but
yeah,
I'm a little bitter. Michael Malice blocked me on Twitter, so I've been bitter about it ever since.
Oh,
I I've still watched his show a bunch of times. I tried to be funny, and he has this thing about like, don't try to make jokes on my jokes or I'll block you. So anyway, it was a couple years ago now, and I've just because it's a lot of times I'll see someone say "haha Michael Malice" or something, and then it's blocked, and I have to,
Anyway, Malice has a weird personality, so I mean, for sure. But it was a really good interview. I liked what he asked Amash about about Congress, and like he was like, how much of what we see is reality as far as like how much they hate each other, and he's like, it is all scripted and all theater. He was like, you see people yelling at each other, the cameras go off, and then they're like walking over and, I've got a bite to eat. It's like, it is just such a freaking, I mean, he says like, for the most part, like there's, obviously.
I would bet AOC really hates Ted Cruz.
Right. Yeah.
I would say I probably believe that one. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like, it's also weird. Like you brought up how weird it is that like we have Donald Trump and then we went to Joe Biden. And like one of the weird things that I've noticed, and like Dave Smith brought this up, is like, isn't it weird how like the boomer generation is basically like has not relinquished power to the younger generations yet? It's like we just keep going, like we keep going through just all the old guard. Like the youngest president we had over the last during my lifetime was Obama, and it's not like he was a super young guy. And then Donald Trump was a bit of an anomaly, but
I think Bush, Clinton, and Donald Trump were all like born in the same summer.
Right. Yeah.
Something like that. It's like legit like 20 years of presidents born in the summer of whatever 1940 something, and it's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy. And Eric Weinstein is someone Weinstein is someone who talks about that a lot and talks about how there are so many boomer college presidents and so many like the age range has continued to grow and those people have kept power. He's an interesting character in a lot of ways and very skeptic of the political system.
I like the Weinstein brothers. I think they're interesting to listen to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's and it's our political system has become so effed that we went from like an egomaniac guy who couldn't stop saying dumb stuff on Twitter and like literally having like a sitcom like a game show host for president to an old white guy with dementia, and we're not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I know. And the thing that I really thought that at the beginning, I got to admit, I recently heard a clip of Trump talking about how we can, wash masks. And he's like, we have great liquids. Like I just missed him, in the moment. It was like, damn, this guy, at least he was entertaining. Like, for what it was worth, man, he was good for a laugh or two a week.
Well, now there's like nothing. Now it's like, there's like the media, like they don't know what to do. Like they hated Trump, but like he was their greatest asset. Cause now it's like, what do we talk about? We have an old guy president that does nothing.
Yeah, talk about Andrew Cuomo now. Yeah, right. I think when it comes to the like discussion around like the I forget where I was going with that. What were we talking about? Talking about Donald Trump made me laugh. Oh yeah, okay. So when Trump was elected, I really thought that there would be like Republicans that got really disgusted by the establishment, and it turned out it was just the establishment Republicans that kind of broke off away from the rest of the party, and the whole party rallied around Trump so hard. And I thought when Biden got elected that there'd be a lot of like real leftists, like the real conservatives would leave Trump and want a more libertarian society, and maybe that would happen with the left now. And I think maybe a little bit, especially with the Biden war stuff. Like real leftists really don't like war. They really don't like the immigration detention camp, whatever stuff, which is terrible, so bad. And one thought that I had that I want to try to say it somewhat clearly, but it's almost like it's a perfect metaphor, right? Where like all of the stuff about how Democrats are going to be so kind to immigrants coming in and migrants and all of that, like it's a perfect bait and switch. Like they tricked all of those people to come here. Whereas I mean, it's easy to imagine a family considering coming up north to, to try to get into the country and not wanting to do it when Trump was president because, they were scared of their kids being locked in cages. But then now they're like, okay, now we'll be welcomed, and they're not. They're still getting, they're getting screwed over by the government now, anyways. But it's like now it's a welcome mat before the cage instead of like a MAGA sign in front of the cage.
Right.
So it's actually worse. It's actually worse, and you could imagine that the rhetoric makes it worse. That's the part that I'm trying to say.
Right,
where you
exactly.
can see how like the generous method and the generous messaging and sounding so kind actually backfires because the government is totally incompetent, and it actually hurts people worse than which is anyway. So it's like a weird, there's a tension there, but I think it's a good example. It illuminates the nature of so many government policies. They promise the world and they end up locking you in cages, and it's tragic, and it's only getting worse. So
but like at least the people in the people in Yemen now can be comforted that like, well, hey, these bombs that are blowing up our town, they seem more tolerant, and more LGBT friendly. So it's all better. I laugh, but it also enrages me and saddens me, and it's like I have a close family member of mine. I think I brought her up last time, who was so mad at me for not voting for Biden because like she was afraid that Trump was going to win and all these bad things were going to happen. And I was just like, I guarantee you Biden will get into office and nothing will change. It was like, and I kept trying to tell her, I was like, I can't just keep voting for duopoly candidates because you're afraid of the other one is exactly the way the system is designed to keep us trapped in this murderous authoritarian empire that we have fallen that we're part of, that people are complicit in. And
well, to me, the way I like to phrase it, or not that I like to phrase it, but to me, like we could call it, we've lived through the past 100 years has been the century of National Socialism. Straight up. Thinking about it as starting at the way I look at it, at least in World War One, this is kind of impacted by some, I shouldn't just call it Glenn Beck stuff because it's just history, really. But like the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the stuff that happened in the late 1919 and around the time of the Treaty of Versailles, they like drew all the maps of the world and made all these countries that kind of existed before, but they really formally made it like a global thing in the League of Nations. And then ever since then, like they came up with more and more, fiat currencies became the norm. They went off the government and central banks became more and more powerful, and the corporate structures became more and more powerful, both in America and around the world. And, one of the things that I saw recently, and I mentioned this earlier with my hatred of Social Security as just a horrible system, but I saw that, the Nazis had an old age program as a part of their, when they took over and they won elections, right? They were democratically elected, at least in the most part. But during the years that the war was just taking off and they were taking over some of the, it went into Poland and a couple other countries, that they doubled the size of their, what would be Social Security, of their old age pension program, including paying off a lot of the people in the new countries that they were going into. So they started just paying off all of their citizens, and they were able to do worse and worse and worse things and demand the sort of loyalty or complacency that is required to commit atrocities and maintain power over a large society. And I think, the reason I ended up going into that was because of my discussion with some other libertarians who were saying that it's not socialism or national anyway. So that was what the discussion was. And I think, it's the programs like that where they just shovel out money to all of the politically connected people, or give everyone a little stimmy, as apparently it's called. It's this idea that that's the way that they maintain their power. They're just there's a and I think it's just tragic. But that's why I think calling it the century of National Socialism is fairly accurate. Just in a simple what those words meant and mean. And like you can point and to me, every example of tyranny and oppression and murder and war crimes around the world has happened on behalf of a state of some level of socialism, whether more of a communist type or what some people would call capitalist, but with essentially run monetary system in many times, or at least heavily regulated healthcare system. And I think we're about to outgrow it. I got to say, I'm white pilled in the sense that I'm very optimistic. To me, like, it's reaching the point of collapse in a good way, where it'll take a while. And I think that there's plenty of reason to think that it could be relatively peaceful. I mean, I'm optimistic across the board that literally it'll just phase out. The dollar will just kind of go away. The federal government will become less and less relevant, and we'll grow into decentralized communities. And hopefully with technology, we can protect ourselves from potential aggressors. I really think like there's a real path there in the next decade or 20 years or so.
Yeah, I have reason to hope too, and I might not be the most white pilled, but I try to be. I'm sitting with the white pill and I'm crushing it up into my water and I'm taking sips from it. Maybe
you're not gonna snort it.
Yeah. One passage, we got to bring some Jesus into this. One passage I think really kind of speaks to all this. This is Mark 10, starting in verse 42. But Jesus called them to himself and said, them being his apostles, and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers," the word there in the Greek is archists, "over Gentiles, lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all." Or the real better word be servant, not slave. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life for a ransom for many. And I think, like leaving some of the theological, like, because there's a little thing at the end where Jesus is kind of referencing some, messianic prophecy. But the other thing there is saying, if you want to be great, like if you want to be a great ruler, even the great leaders are people who serve people, not people who lord and rule over everybody with power and might. And to me, it's like part of the problem of our society right now is like even the people that might have good intentions that are wrapped up in, like I was talking about, like that, what I would call like a pathology of empathy, where like they're just so, well, I want people to have healthcare. I want people to have housing. I want people to be taken care of. It's like, yes, but how you do things is important. And if you are going through life advocating that we need strong men to rule over people, to make things the way you want to be them, according to Jesus, you are last, not first. Because if you want the world to be better, it's not about electing strong men to rule from on high and from top down force people to do things, but rather you need to be a servant. You need to go out there, and if you don't like the way the world is, you need to go be the change. If you don't like the fact that people are starving, go feed them. If you don't like the fact that people don't have the healthcare they need, go find the people that are struggling, whether they're homeless or they have unpaid medical bills, and help donate whatever you can, help organize GoFundMes and fundraisers, especially the church. This message is for everybody, but I'll, especially as a Christian, call out my fellow Christian brothers and sisters. As a church, like, we need to do better. We need to be not sure. Just be looking to and we do a good job of, I'm not saying we don't do anything, but we need to do more, and we need to be less focused with building bigger buildings, and we need to be focused on building bigger and better ministries and going out there. And another passage that comes to mind is, the least of these. Jesus said, "What you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me." And to me, that is part of what's missing from society, which is like, listen, I don't want people to starve on the streets. I don't want people to suffer. But how do we solve these problems? Do we solve them with strong men and authoritarianism, or do we solve them by being a servant, by going out there and doing what you feel called to do? And it's great if you have that passion to help people, but then go out there and live and live out that passion. And even if I'm going to take a step back and get off being morally outraged at how people do this, it also just doesn't work. Like it's so inefficient. It's so like if we compare private charities to the state, even the worst run private charities are so much better than state run welfare, because the state run welfare is so bogged down with bureaucracy. There's no accountability. There's no competition there. Like within the state, it's just, half the money is just, and then the money gets thrown to people, but it's just thrown at them. And that's a lot of times just throwing money at problems doesn't help. Like if you have a business that's failing, like let's say like not failing because of lockdowns or outside influences, but just like the business isn't doing well, just throwing them $10,000, like maybe it helps, but at the same time, if they've gotten to that point because they've made mistakes, then just giving them $10,000 to blow through to keep making the same mistakes isn't going to help them. Like help is not just about let's just throw resources at something, which is, that's what we do with schools right now. How much is that working out? Like how much money have we thrown into the inner cities, into schools, and for what? Like we can't just throw.
Yeah. Well, and I think like you said about no competition, that's a huge part of it. And I think in terms of the, market forces compared to government control of various industries, that's a huge part.
Yeah, and it's just we need that. We need people to be out there, and if I was going to like come up with a slogan for like combining praxeology and Christianity, it'd be like be a student and be a servant. Like be open-minded, be going through the world humble with that like what Christ called like that childlike attitude, because Jesus said that the kingdom of God belongs to those such as these, as the children, so we need to approach life with that humbleness, to not think that we know what's best for everyone. We need to just we need to decide what's best for us and run our lives, and then if we want to do things out in the world, we need to be doing it as a servant. It's what Jesus says. And I think that is a very biblical way of looking at the both the praxeological and the libertarian worldviews, and the explanations for why our world is going through the trials that it is now. And I don't think that a lot of people realize the connection too between giving the state the power of welfare and the power over our currency. And like, because let's be honest, none of these programs can be funded through the mechanisms of taxation alone, and they waste all this money. And then but then what they really do, the thing that they really care about, you brought this up, was the expansion of the centralized banking system and the Federal Reserve. And people often will be like, why are libertarians so many of them saying end the Fed? Like, why is that such like a big deal? And I'm like, because how do you think that they do all this stuff that they do? Like, how do you think they're able to wage all these wars? How do you think they're able to and that's my problem, is that when you give the state, you give these strong men this power to do all the good things you want them to do, and then naively trust that they're not going to abuse it. It just blows my mind. Yeah. Like,
I think, and this is where, and I think, to the argument that, to the efficiency of the market, there's also, a collection of arguments that I find more and more compelling and useful. I think in terms of advocating for political change, and then being able to respond to what about, the big powerful corporation or private business that comes in and crushes people and oppresses them. And I think that there are some left-wing market anarchist ideas that are really focused on the opposition to hierarchy, and essentially like a trade policy that creates governance, but that is really run by consumers. And so in what I am trying to describe there is, like, if the argument is something like, Like if it wasn't for government trade policy, then people would just buy all the stuff from China, and we'd be supporting, the atrocities in China otherwise, or we'd be, supporting the sweatshops and like that sort of stuff. And I think that because of government taking such a large role in arranging the economy, even though many people would consider it still a free market, the left-wing market anarchist lingo is to call it a freed market. We want to get the government out of the way. And I think that thinking about it in that sense of taking what is kind of free but heavily regulated and controlled and manipulated, and pushing it in that direction where we make the market argument, always focused on that idea that, okay, yes, there will still be problems. It's not that this is a panacea, but that government makes it worse every time. And I think the focus on one of the things that you were saying, there's something else I wanted to respond to that you said earlier, but I kind of lost it.
Well,
but no, just yeah.
If it comes back to you, let me know. But yeah, it's funny you bring that up. I'm actually interviewing a libertarian socialist this weekend. I don't know if you know him, Kevin Shaw. But he's been in the Libertarian Party a while, involved in stuff. But yeah, there are a lot of things about like the libertarian socialism and left, like the mutualist anarchist thought that I can appreciate. And I can appreciate how they don't like unjust hierarchy. They want more what they view as like not coercive markets. They want markets that are more like democratic. It's like their big thing. And it's like, listen, I don't have any problem with.
I think decentralized is a bigger part of it than democratic.
Well,
at least
a lot of them will be like, well, a lot of the ones I talk to at least use the word democratic. But I think what a more better answer would be that we want decentralized markets. And I think that you can't have democratic in the sense of like you can have worker co-ops, you can have institutions in the market that run themselves democratically instead of like one person in charge of 500 employees. Like I have no problem with that. The only divide I see between the economic left and the economic right in the libertarian anarchist sense is just that there's some intolerance on both sides where you got some people on the economic right saying throw communists and socialists out of helicopters, and then you got some on the left like the tankies saying we need to with force take out the capitalist scum and prevent people from
expropriation.
So
all that
so
stuff.
If we push those people to the side, I feel like I don't have much of an issue with the left anarchists that if they're not advocating for that, it's like I think a truly decentralized anarchic market is going to organize in a lot of diverse ways, and probably different industries and different areas are just they're going to try different things, and that's great. And that's part of competition. That's part of to me that's all part of Austrian economics. It's like it's there's nothing wrong with collective organization if it's done voluntarily through the market. I mean that is definitely part of human action. That's what you could say that's what the Mises Caucus is doing. They're we're trying to collectivize a lot of similarly minded libertarians to accomplish goals, not so much in the market, but kind of. There's a little bit of overlap there. Like we're engaging people in the marketplace and then trying to get them into the political sphere. But it's the same concept. But it has to be, just has to be reducible down to individual consent.
Yes, voluntarism.
Right.
Yes,
exactly.
That's, and I think to what you were talking about before about how the people with empathy, especially on the left, and one of the things I brought up the last time we talked was my thought that we can see that the different motivation of the left and the right in the tension of like the pathos versus the ethos rhetoric, where the right is trying to conserve the authority and the hierarchy of the Constitution, whereas the left wants to help the people that are hurting. The problem is that the left gets it confused in the sense that when it tries to help people by building a more powerful hierarchy that puts people above others inherently in an oppressive relationship because there isn't that protection of consent, right? That's where it becomes, the abusive and pathological in that same way. So trying to, I think trying to, I guess it depends on the people that you're talking to, but trying to make the argument that, instead of advocating for Medicare for all, you should go out and help people. I think that's really kind of having two different conversations. That I think if someone's advocating for a certain political policy, you want to try to engage like on that policy and why you have a different perspective on, and like to start with, we share the same goals, but here's why I think your policy is evil, or some nicer version of that, right? And so because there are a lot of different reasons why we could describe why federal control of individual healthcare decisions is a bad idea. And so trying to find what are people maybe more sensitive to. If someone has had someone that they know who has had problems or criminal problems from the drug war, okay, well, that's a form of universal healthcare. The government decides what substances you're allowed to put into your body. That's a form of healthcare that they're denying people, or they're providing to people. Really think about it. That was their argument. They need to protect people from the bad drugs. That's healthcare, right? I mean, and so trying to reframe the way that they imagine government services to be provided is a challenge. It's not something that seems to be going well in so many ways, and that's where I think instead of trying to figure out issues where people are passionate, figure out one of the areas where they actually hate the government and they notice that the government is hurting people. Catch people on the way out of the DMV saying, yeah, don't you hate the government? Or in other situations, maybe after tax day, which
right. Yeah, I think you have to do is you have to show people the evil of the state, and you might have to do that by first talking to them about the things where they most notice the abusive power of the state, and then you have to, like you said, have the conversations about the things that they really care about and want, why they think we need the state, and to just start having those conversations to be like, well, let's examine this step by step and let's see how effective this is, and let's see what show them the inefficiency of it and how it doesn't provide both, even if it, because sometimes it might work short term, and I think a lot of the time the problem is they look at the short term. And then like the danger of like the Keynesian economic systems that the West uses is that like through the ability to print money, you can really prolong the costs of these things for a very long time and create these bubbles and then do all these economic resets and stuff. And it's like and that I don't know a clear-cut way to get people to see that for what it is. I mean, it was hard for me to see that for what it was, and I was very my history teacher practically brainwashed us in our AP history. Like I took AP history like in my junior year, and he practically brainwashed our class in Keynesian economics. Like, so it was like, it wasn't just like I was taught like just the typical how the New Deal was great and stuff. Like, I mean, it was like a borderline, like when people talk about public school being like public indoctrination camps, like I don't just use that term in a tongue-in-cheek hyperbolic fashion. Like I really do think for a lot of teachers that's how they view it. Like they, whether it's consciously, implicitly or not, like they indoctrinate their worldview on students, and I was indoctrinated in that.
Well, they try to, but not even, and I don't even think in at least in many cases, my guess would be that it's not in any malicious way. And I would guess also that many of them are very ineffective. I had very, liberal teachers. I wrote my big senior essay on how great Ronald Reagan was, just to kind of mess with the lady who was, had to grade it. And then, I mean, and also because that's what I thought. I thought Reagan, saved the country from the Cold War because what it took actually was spending a shitload of money on the military. That's what did it. And obviously that's not true, and I've learned that now. But at the time, that was the argument that I had consumed, and I thought it was more compelling than the argument that, whatever, LBJ, Great Society was super helpful, and the New Deal was so great and the Russians were, it was just communism didn't work the way it was written so nicely on the paper kind of stuff, And I think,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely ways that you can,
Yeah.
especially like in a history setting, there's definitely ways to teach American history in a way that plays at people's emotions and that constructs a very like ass backwards narrative. And I mean, I was,
Sure.
like heavy focus on the terrors of the Gilded Age and the free market combined with the savior of FDR and the Great New Deal and Keynesian economics. Like, I took that all the way to 2015, and it was hard for me to see the failures of that system for what it was, and to be shown that.
Yeah. And I think to that problem in the world, the greatest hero in our society is Tom Woods. That man has written so much on it. That homeschool curriculum is so good. And not that I've seen all of it, but I've seen some of it in the Liberty Classroom. It's just like this wealth of knowledge. And maybe some of it is even over libertarianized. I don't know. But it's because the way that he writes it is so factual. And it's not like, it's all so documented, and everything that he produces, it always has that like, clear cut. These are historical, almost indisputable, if not like, just clearly laid out arguments and timelines of all the details that you don't know and that you didn't learn in school for damn sure. And that's what the book's always, the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and the Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. Maybe Capitalism was written by Bob Murphy. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think Tom wrote 2 of those books, and like they're wonderful, and they're available for free on Audible.
Right.
You have the audiobook. I mean, like if you have the Audible subscription, which is a wonderful service from a giant corporation, but whatever. Yeah. So, but I just think like there is so much alternative content out there now, and optimistic about the counterculture being so disgusted by all of the woke social justice-y nonsense that people are putting out now, that I think there's going to be a lot of young people and people across the board that are just like, man, these people are wackos, man. Like they judge people based on their skin color in this crazy self-righteous way. And I don't want to have any part of that. I think that's stupid. And that does not jive with my experience in my life. So I think people are being more and more turned away. At least I hope so. I'm optimistic. It seems like that's happening from my whatever perspective. But obviously, there's a long way to go. And obviously those ideas are also gaining traction in many circles. So
that's a good segue to the other thing we wanted to talk about, which is all the the SJW wokeism that you see on social media. And like I don't know where this fits into praxeology. Like this is something that weighs heavy on my heart from a Christian perspective, and I don't know what your reaction to it would be. One of the hardest passages in the Bible is one of the hardest messages, and it comes from like 2 passages. It's in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's also in Romans 12, and it's the message of loving your enemies. And like the first one on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "You've heard it say, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you now that if someone strikes you, on your cheek, turn to them the other cheek. And if someone asks you to walk a mile with them, walk an extra mile. And if, and in Romans 12, Paul echoes the same message, says that bless those who persecute you, and to just the message of loving our enemies. And like I think what Paul says is like, don't even the Gentiles, even the Gentiles and the godless love their friends. But we should be better than that. We should love even the people who hate us. And that was even more especially like radical for Paul to say, then, considering like they were dealing with hatred that was more than just like people calling them names on social media. They were being stoned in public by people who legitimately hated them and wanted to kill the early church. So those are like, as a Christian, like like I hear those I see those things written down. I want to take them to heart. That's what Jesus did. Jesus did that on the cross. Like he was on the cross being killed, and he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Like, you know, which like I don't think any of us could have like the ability to love on people that are hating us to that degree, to be like, as you're being killed, to just like look down at people and be like, forgive them. And that is part of what motivates me in my interactions with a lot of the stuff that we see on social media. And as much as like I can like I'm the first one to blast statism, but I'm very hesitant to blast people, and I try to give people a lot of patience and to do my best to interact with people in good faith, even if they are interacting with me in bad faith. So
I guess, yeah.
before we get into any specifics, like what do you think of that in like a praxeological sense, as far as like loving your enemies and you know what that, how that comes into play?
All right. So I guess my it starts with the pursuit of self-interest. All right. To me, like recognizing that everything we do is in the pursuit of self-interest. You benefit from learning from your enemies. You know, the art of war, everything in there. The sentiment about the better you understand your enemy, the more successful you will be. So loving your enemy means getting to know them, means having their best interests at heart. So having to try to have a productive conversation with someone who disagrees with you or has a view that that would harm you is certainly a noble goal, right? Like I think absolutely trying to bring enemies towards having a well, I guess one part of this as well is that there's an element of love, and whether it's the phileo or the brotherly love kind, where just simply engaging in mutually beneficial trade could be considered an act of love. And if you're loving your enemies in a mutually beneficial, exchange, then you're meeting that that task. But also, it's not love your enemies at the expense of yourself. It's love your enemies because that's the best thing for you also. And one of the Jordan Peterson rules is that I never get any of his rules exactly right, but it's like assume that the person you're talking to has something worth learning, or that they know something that you could benefit from. It basically is the sentiment. And so I think that idea right there, along with the idea of seeing yourself as a humble and curious student, right? I think like that's the a lot of the stuff that Jesus says about be like a child. Like that's what he's talking about. At least that's the way I see it, is that you're pursuing learning in the same way that a child does. You just inherently, naturally has to automatically, just perceive the world around them and learn from it. That's the benefit of loving your enemies, compared to, in the same way that I mentioned. I'm sure I don't remember exactly what I said, but I've said this kind of thing before, where by being offended by what somebody else says, you're losing. You're not benefiting from having a more productive conversation, or you're just manufacturing your own negative emotion. And I don't remember if I said this last time, but one of the examples I think is a bit silly, but it's like if a 5-year-old calls you a doo-doo head, right? You don't like, oh, not my head is not made of doo-doo. That's mean. Like that doesn't get under your skin. That doesn't bother you. That's just like a little kid making an insult. And I think like that's the way that, I think of all insults. Like I mean, yeah, other than my dog, when he's really bad, he gets under my skin a little bit because he can be a real little troublemaker and he knows better, right? But like for the most part, any person like does not, make me mad in that way. Like I'll be sad for them. And just as one little extra detail here, in the loving your enemy sense, Camille Foster talked about this a while ago, and he talks about lots of race issues at times. But there was a discussion about they were talking about like poor people in Alabama and Mississippi who are, like old white racists or something, right? And Camille's message was like, I feel sorry for those people. Those people are confused and ignorant, and I pity them, right? And I think that idea of like, I pity the fool, right, kind of thing, right? There's tons of Bible verses too that tell you what to do with a fool. And fools are about, spouting their own ideas. They're not pursuing understanding. And so I think if you realize, okay, I'm messing with a fool, I don't hate them, I don't really love them, but maybe I could benefit from, seeing their foolishness, learning how to become less foolish myself, and just always viewing it through that lens of pursuit of self-interest, not in like in a negatively greedy or selfish way, but just in a descriptive way of like everything that we do, it will end up impacting our future interests, right? Our actions impact, have consequences in that sense, right? So I think trying to take an assessment of whether someone is worthwhile to have a discussion with, whether there's any benefit either for you to improve your communication or potentially to change their mind and to have the satisfaction of serving them in a sense of clearing up their ignorance. There's the Buddhist concept of evil has nothing to do with like some inner conscience or something. It's just ignorance. It's just not recognizing that being honest and good is better than
there's a Christian parallel to that, which like you said that in the last conversation, and I was re-listening to it. I was re-listening to it last week, and I realized there's a Christian parallel to that, which is sin separates you from God, which is basically the same thing. Like God is truth, like Jesus is the logos. Yes. And when you sin, and the Bible says like sin, the problem with sin, the Bible says, is that it cuts you off from God. And I think that's basically the same thing, which is like, evil or like wrongdoing is in a way a form of ignorance. I think that is true. That's an interesting way of looking at loving your enemy. There is like a dichotomy in the Christian world as far as like, do you love your enemy to the point of spiting yourself? Because, the apostles did that and Jesus did that. And it does seem to be, I take like a little bit. So that is like an ongoing.
I would disagree with that though. Not that I disagree with the way you said it, but that in the praxeological sense, right? That they did not do anything to intentionally harm themselves. They thought what their actions were, and obviously because they acted in the way that they did, that what they were doing was in the best interest. It was in pursuit of their ends, right? And maybe it was in a short term, in a fleshly sense or whatever, that it was costly, that it was sacrificial. But in the sense of like what the praxis of logos, right? Like if you see yourself as my human action is about Jesus in the Christian praxeological sense, that's what I think of it as, right? That you realize that you're using yourself as a means is inherently sacrificial because it's actually better to live in that way. And that's that James 1:25 where it says the perfect law that brings liberty. It's like when you kind of submit to that self, and not that this is anything that I'm necessarily good at, just in a philosophical sense, right? Like in terms of how we can think about our action, how we can, view our enemies or our goals, or how we see ourself most of all, right? Is we are a means. We are dust in the wind or whatever. All of the things that they say about the temporary nature of life, the stuff from Ecclesiastes, a lot of that. When you realize that, it's not like a depressing thing. It's an empowering thing to take that burden away and think about it in a more just in a simplified sense, and also, to me at least, in a more accurate sense of really what the nature of our existence is. And then with that understanding, or with that like approach, then it guides us in terms of how we operate and cooperate.
Yeah, that is a really, like, that what you just said, as far as like it was sacrificial in like a short-term sense, but it wasn't in terms of what their self-interest was and what they were trying to do. I think that's a really like that is really striking to me, because it kind of fills in the gap in my understanding of how I've always viewed these passages. Because one of the debates in the Christian world is like if these passages teach pacifism or not. And my gut intuition has always been, if a random stranger is committing violence against you for not like, just like you're going through your life and like they're trying to take something from you, you have a right to defend yourself. But if in the act of service to God, like being an apostle, going out there preaching the word, or doing good, you're doing good in the face of evil, if you fall under persecution, that you should continue to do good, to follow Christ, even to the point of death. And that it's not about condemning self-defense, but it's about saying some things are worth, that if your self-interest in them is so great and you view that calling, that that ethos that's calling you as great enough that you will die for it, and that is what best serves your interests. Like, does that make sense? Like, I'm trying to put it in my own words.
That's what I was trying to get at too, right? This is the part of the challenge. We're dealing with like these just deep philosophical ideas and trying to translate it into it's somebody praxeology and economic, the economic science. And I think one little side note to that is Bob Murphy is a Christian economist, pacifist,
right?
And one of the things that struck me, I was listening to him have a conversation with a guy who wrote a book. You'd really enjoy the interview, I would guess. And the guy had some degree in theology and wrote the book about like an anarchist Christian perspective, and how there were examples all through the Bible of like slavery and taxes when the new king would come in, or the empire, and so all these different kings and like the discussion of power and authority. But Bob's argument for pacifism, to me, like, I think he makes a great argument. I've heard him kind of go through it in a couple different ways, but I think that there's an argument from a different angle where, depending on the type of aggression, right? Like if someone is like, if you're in a situation where someone's bullying you and they're actually like causing you some physical harm, you try to talk them out of it, you try to look for other options, but there could be like, you could, in the loving your enemy sense, hit them right in their mouth and teach them a lesson that could actually benefit them in the long run, right? Like you could easily make an argument that someone, getting popped in the face and having a quick correction as a response to their poor behavior is in some sense loving them. And maybe to take a slightly from a different angle, right? In terms of not from a pacifist versus like physically aggressive sort of difference, but in terms of like when it's your job to take control. When do you have responsibility to take control of a situation? And you can think of like restraining someone who's wasted from trying to get behind a car and drive, or you could think of a parent trying to stop a child from doing something that could be very harmful to them. So there are times when you have to put yourself out there and act in the world in a way that could violate our oversimplified version of like the non-aggression principle, where you are confiscating the agency from someone else who is either incapable or has could benefit from a lesson. So I think like there's a lot of different angles to it, and I think that there's a similar sort of argument where if people are making terrible arguments and they're saying lots of bad things, that trying to engage with them in a more like stern harsh method, or like really condemn like what we should with the lockdowns, right? Like people are doing really bad things, we should speak out aggressively against that. That it fits the same model of like how we should act in the right or wrong sort of how we evaluate the morality of our action, and the menu of choices that we potentially have in any moment in terms of how we act. And one thing also in terms of when I was talking before, like with the pursuit of self-interest, like Jesus was always in pursuit of his own self-interest, right? Like that's the way I look at it. And that's not the way that people usually think about self-interest as like a greedy thing. But I think also, but like just in that descriptive sense, it's a better way of phrasing it is to think of it as like we all have our own individual subjective value hierarchies. Like that's the way I look at it. We have our top values of the most important things that we need to accomplish, and the more basic things, the more that our basic needs are met, the more we're able to pursue those higher level opportunities. And I think that trying to bridge that gap of recognizing that, absolutely, people have basic needs when we're engaging in political discussion about, like the sort of UBI type questions or the basic services provided by the state that are supposed to, fill the basic needs of people, that we recognize that there are those basic needs, but there's also the most important fundamental inherent, and it's not even like a need, it's just like the nature of our existence, is that we are agents and we act. And so like, recognizing that each individual has that and has that capability, and like treating people as though they're competent and capable rather than someone who needs to be treated as a prisoner or a subject in some other way, have everything provided to them. That's a very condescending approach. And so I think trying to apply the Jesus method or the Jesus approach, like one of the things I probably said on your show last time too is like Jesus, the meanest he ever was to the religiously self-righteous, establishment, right? Those are the people that he yelled at. And right. I think having that harsh reaction towards the most wrong people is justified. So I guess the question was more about the physical violence versus pacifism.
Right. Yeah. And and that could be almost a whole different video. Would be like going through the relation of praxeology and pacifism versus non-pacifism, I guess. But it's that is a very internal ongoing debate in the Christian community, especially in the Christian anarchist and libertarian community. A lot of prominent Christian anarchists are pacifists, and Tolstoy was, Bob Murphy is, several others are. But yeah, that could be. But that is an interesting way of putting it. And I think this is where like an understanding of like Ayn Rand and objectivism comes into play. Like I think that she made a really good argument about self-interest and how like that isn't like being selfish isn't something that is like a boogeyman, I guess, that like we've been told we're always told like growing up, like don't be selfish, like that person is mean and selfish, and like there's just all these negative connotations added to those terms of selfish and self-interested, and they're not, they shouldn't be cast as these negative things. I don't think it's necessary. I guess what we should talk about here then at the end with this framing that we discussed, you wanted to talk to me about my engagements with so I do a lot of engaging with people who are very anti Mises Caucus, and so this takes place on Facebook in like the Faketarians discussion group. This also takes place on Twitter, and you are watching in both instances some of my interactions with some probably some amusement, and but also trying to, you wanted to talk, you talked to me privately, and we thought we would talk about this a bit more here at the end, just to kind of provide some some useful, like I have no problem with the word criticism. I think criticism is good. I think constructive criticism is good. And so yeah, I mean, I think if you want to share your criticisms of that and your thoughts and feelings towards what I've been doing, and whether it's a good use of my time, and maybe I can then also try to explain my side and why I think it aligns in my self-interests, and just see where we end up. But I think it's an interesting conversation, because to me it's kind of like me kind of trying to ride this tension of like I'm part of this caucus now, and there's a group of people that, because of my association with it, hate me and slander me, and they're slandering the caucus. And we talked about this a bit last time, even before I was in the caucus. Like I was like, well, what should the caucuses and the leaders within the caucus, what should the response be to this? And a lot of it has been to they're like monetize the haters, and they came up with the phrase loser brigade, and I don't know, like it's just, that's not my style. Like my style is not to meet fire with fire, so to speak. Like when people hate me, it's kind of like, all right, like let's sit down and talk, and like sling your arrows at me. It's like I want to figure out I always want to try to be the bigger person and try to work towards reconciliation, even if I have every reason to believe that the other person doesn't. But that doesn't mean that it's, maybe I've spent too much time there. Maybe I haven't gone about it the best ways. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would say I agree with all of your sentiment there. My only especially when you said you want to, sit down and hash things out and talk and that type of thing. Totally agree. That's all productive, good stuff. I haven't read all of the stuff you post, and like I mentioned before, like I see, you write something that sounds like thoughtful and you're curious and you ask a bunch of questions and they just say, pretty harsh things to you and they call you an idiot and how you haven't like read stuff and why are you still here anyway, like all that kind of stuff. And it's, I would say my perspective on the utility of talking to especially libertarian minded people with different perspectives is that like I mentioned, and I know you've interacted with him a little bit recently on Facebook too, but James Weeks, the infamous naked guy from 2016, he's the chair of my local party and I'm the vice chair, and he encouraged me to run for Congress. And when we first met, there is a little bit of tension and stuff, but we had fun conversation. We sat there and before COVID and had a couple beers and had good fun boisterous conversations. And now on our video chat calls, the me and the two more left leaning, somewhat infamous within the Libertarian Party, Jeff and James, the three of us just all talk almost the whole time. We're just like all yelling at each other, but it's all in like good faith and banter. And it's like, and we talk about history, and they're both smart, intelligent, interesting characters. And they disagree on some stuff sometimes too. And so like my process of engaging with them has been immensely productive and fruitful. Like I found it very enjoyable. A couple years ago, I engaged with a bunch of anarcho-communists on Twitter and ended up reading some Kropotkin. That might have been the first time I ever read any Konkin stuff too. Maybe not. But either way, like I got into some interesting, conversations, learned some stuff. And my understanding of the other potential viewpoints changed. And it definitely had a big opinion or had a big influence on my opinion that libertarian political rhetoric should attempt to be left-wing almost always. It just in the sense, and we talked about this before, but in the sense of not trying to conserve like the good parts of the state, but trying to help the people that are being oppressed, to point towards the people who are suffering, to have empathy, to talk about the problem of the stagnant, corrupt hierarchy, and those are left-wing arguments. So I think my perception on that has changed from engaging in somewhat spirited conversation, to say the least. But I felt like it was productive when, well, I guess sometimes on Twitter it was productive just because of links and kind of getting to know some people and engaging in some conversations. But more importantly, with in person, when you can talk and go back and forth and actually have a constructive conversation. Whereas with social media, so much of that gets lost in the lack of hearing someone's intonation with the way that they're speaking. We really, going from the spoken word to the written word is a huge drop off in the ability to understand what someone's trying to communicate. And that's something that I'm very like self-conscious about, where a lot of times when I've written stuff, I hate the way that it sounds after I write it, even though I have, generous, kind intentions when I write it, it sounds, snotty afterwards, or it doesn't communicate the tone that I'm trying to. So social media just makes it worse, especially when it's, people assume that there's already like a combative, disagreeable tone, that they read things with an even more disagreeable. And I've done the same thing. I've not, tried to give someone the benefit of the doubt at times and thought that their arguments were just horrible. Well, my only contention for you, and I think I just, when I messaged you, and we had talked about doing this before, and we just wanted to add this as a part of the conversation, but I was just curious about why you would do that for so long. And apparently they like you. Yeah, they I mean, I know you've gone on a podcast with some of those guys, and like I said, I've seen some entertaining stuff from them, and
that was brutal.
Really?
I didn't complain about it, but I wasn't expecting there to be like 5 of them. Like I thought it was gonna be like me and Hudak, and like usually Hudak has like a host, like a co-host. It's like I was expecting like 2 people. I got on it with like a panel of like 5 or 6 people. I was like, what did I walk into?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and like, if it's all in good faith, right? And if it's people trying to sort out problems and offer solutions and have interesting conversation, then that's totally different. That's like a totally different sector of like potential interaction. and cooperation, right? But then there's the other side of it where it's like people are just trying to, live in their echo chambers and not be curious. And I think, yeah, I like a lot of libertarians, right? And I've enjoyed some of the fakertarian stuff that I've seen over the past months. And like I'm sure a lot of those people are good libertarians that have different perspectives. The hatred of the Mises Caucus is just a form of whatever intolerance or judgmentalism. It's not based in any sort of real thing. And for whatever extent that it is, right? Like one of the things that you may want to talk about is a specific question around the Hotep Jesus character,
right?
And that you've been interested in and trying to kind of navigate and be like a moderate voice for. And to me, like the question about him being a part of the Libertarian Party or him being a part of Mises Caucus is like anybody who says what he says about the state and the duopoly is clearly on our team. And if we're trying to be like not like a third party, a fringe group, but like the third party where it's like those two and then us, then someone like him needs to be welcomed, warmly in the same way that, the anarcho-communists should be, and the same way that, anybody who thinks Joe Biden is a war criminal, come on into our team. Maybe we disagree on some economics, but if you think that the politicians in Washington, D.C. should have way less power, then the Libertarian Party should be a home for those people. Like, I think to me, like it could be that simple. If you oppose federal government violence, I'm good with it. And like, and you recognize, yeah, I think it's that simple.
I agree with everything you just said. I'm in a weird place where like my goals and my values very closely align with the Mises Caucus, but I'm able to empathize and understand through conversations why people have a negative opinion of Mises. And it's tough because I see a lot of bad conversations that have happened and drama that have happened over time. And the problem is like I'm coming in kind of like after the fact, like after the volcano has erupted, after the bombs have dropped, and there's no perfect way to go about it. And it probably would be better to do things more in person, although it's or face to face like this, but it's just that's harder to set up, harder to convince people to do. And a lot of this stuff happens over social media, and I try to pick and choose my interactions as I can. I've definitely not always done as good of a job as I can at taking time to reflect on what I say before I say it. And I've had times where I think, if I had said things in groups that didn't have a negative opinion of Mises, they would have been taken fine. But when I said them in these groups, they were just taken the wrong way. And people became very, certain people became very angry with me. But there's also a lot of people I've built good connections with. I've been able to build a good connection with Hudak, with Jeremy. I'm reaching out to Kevin Shaw, talking to him on Sunday. There's another person who I won't mention by name because I don't know if he wants to be named, but he reached out and talked to me privately and said, listen, like, I think maybe you said some things in a way that got taken the wrong way, but like, I can tell you're trying to come at this from a good perspective and a good position. I don't think you're a bad person. He has a lot of problems with the Mises Caucus. Like, he thinks the caucus is bad, is promoting entryism, is doing all these things. But he was like,
so what does that mean? What does that mean, promoting entryism? And is that something you find concerning?
So this was like an argument that Dave Smith had with a debate he had with Archie Manning, who I think is the state chair of Vermont. Archie Flower. He's the state chair of Vermont, I believe. Or a county chair in Vermont. And I don't know, Vermont might not be very big. It might only have one county. I don't know. But yeah, so people are saying the Mises Caucus is promoting entryism, and then like we are curtailing our message to appeal to the right, and specifically alt-right, kind of fringe right types, and racists and bigots. and to bring them into the party. And they also have described it as like what they call the paleo strategy, which they say historically has been tried in the party before by like,
Sure.
you know, it was
Murray
something,
Rothbard.
yeah,
Yes.
late
Rothbard had
Rothbard.
part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
So that's what they think we are doing. And Hotep kind of like, you know, plays at that a little bit because he, you know, he has said some things.
Okay.
Because he has not because he's a paleo, but because he has said things that are. I mean, and I'll be honest, you know, and I'm not trying to be overly sensitive here. I am a Jew who, I mean, I'm a religious Christian, but like ethnically Jewish, who grew up next door neighbors that were actually like, the father was an ex-Klansman, had like a Nazi tattoo, and the son was raised in that environment. And when he found out I was Jewish, bullied me pretty relentlessly for a couple years. And it was sad because like we weren't friends, but like he was literally friendly with me up until the point he found out I was Jewish. And then it was like turned on a dime and was just vile and racist towards me. So it was, you know,
Weird.
that was, yeah. So I'm not, so like I've experienced blatant anti-Semitism before. So I don't like a lot of the things that Hotep says. I think that a lot of those things are, you could describe as problematic. And especially, I understand why some libertarians would be hesitant for a guy like Hotep to be involved in the party or associated with the philosophy. Like no one wants someone who says things like the Holocaust didn't happen to be associated with libertarianism. Sure. But at the same time, I definitely hear what you're saying, which is like, I like that he's an anarchist. I like that he's quoting Rothbard.
Yeah.
I love that stuff.
My argument is simpler than that, though. Like, because I agree, but it's really just the simple fact that like the only way to win in politics is to build broad coalitions. Mm-hmm. So if he thinks that, like, I mean, just whatever, if he thinks the Holocaust is kind of fake or he has other, like, you know, bad views, but he also doesn't want, like, the big political power to, like, he doesn't want to have perpetual wars and he doesn't want to have, you know, government run healthcare.
And he has clarified he's had multiple conversations with David Smith. He's clarified that,
I heard those.
He views people, he treats people as individuals. He doesn't advocate for any kind of violence. So it's like, it's not that I'm not sitting here triggered at Hotep, but I can understand why some people are uneasy with it. And
I guess what I'm saying is more than like, instead of being like a social club, right, where it's like this person is going to impact our brand because he has a platform and he's going to be a part of our team. We're a political movement. There are going to be people who agree with our ideas or some of our ideas, but not all of them. And they don't represent the whole group, right? And it's almost like the keep no record of wrongs kind of thing, in terms of like, that's one of the things of love that love does, is keep no record of wrongs. That's the way to think of both friends and enemies, right? It's not focused on whatever, and it's not to even minimize or in any way like say that anything bad that people say doesn't matter, right? Like it's like, to me at least, it's a different question. And it's simply about the fact of like, it's almost to a different angle is like, all PR is good PR kind of thing, where just like someone like him bringing attention to the Mises Caucus or the Libertarian Party is great. A lot of people have no idea what it is. And so if they hear some of his message and they're like, yeah, he has some weird ideas. And the thing that always gets me about the entryist argument, like even that word, right? That assumes that the bad ideas will win. Like that's the only reason that's a compelling argument, is a fearful argument. I guess entryism inherently is a fearful argument that the stupid ideas will beat the good ideas, the consistent ideas.
And this is where this is where I diverge, because while I can see why people could have concerns, there's a difference to me between having concerns and being just offended, which I don't operate that way. Like I don't see things and go, oh, that's well, that's just offensive and racist, and you don't you just shouldn't be here. You shouldn't talk. You shouldn't I don't view that as helpful or productive, because I just think it's just a reality of life that there are going to be some people that have racist and bigoted or wrong ideas, and they're still people. They are, to me, it's like I treat them with love and compassion and respect the same way I treat statists, like someone who, even if there's like a boomer con who is advocating for why the war in Yemen is good, like I would even try to treat that person with respect. But then I compare someone like, like Bill Weld, or like a bad libertarian who like has literally helped to push the wars and stuff, and to push these awful things the state has done. And I contrast that with someone like Hotep, who's like, he said some things I don't really like or agree with, but has he done anything to actually commit violence or advocate for violence? So like I can appreciate the nuance in these things, and I don't act offended by the association with Hotep, but I've been a little bit vocal about it because there's been plenty of people within the Mises Caucus who themselves just kind of spoke up and said, yeah, I'm not exactly about that, and kind of like, like caught off guard with how quickly, like, things kind of escalated with Hotep coming on Dave's show. And then, now we're hosting him in a California event, and people were like, okay, like it was just kind of like caught people by surprise, and people are asking questions about that. And I'm saying there's nothing wrong with libertarians of any stripe and color, both in the caucus and out in the caucus, kind of being a little, having some whiplash from, or concerns about Hotep. I think that there are good answers for those, and we should engage in those conversations and provide people with those good answers. Some people are going to be more open to those answers than others. I don't envision people in the vegetarian circles being okay with Hotep anytime soon. Like they're going to continue to be extremely upset by it, and that's just because they're engaged in this.
They'll post the screenshots from like 2012 or 2015,
right?
Or whatever,
and it's like,
and that's fine. I mean,
and it's like,
whatever,
listen,
someone's
like,
got to be the historian, yeah.
And it's like, it's just, I get what they're coming from, but I don't operate in the I'm very much like what you said. Like, being offended to me just isn't helpful. Like, all right, like, I'm offended, I'm going to sit here and call this racist and bigoted, and okay, cool. Now what? Like,
well, it's a form of social capital, right? Like the benefit of it is in terms of internally, and like the mental health side of it, it's bad. It's a form of just manufacturing negative emotion, and the consequences of just like literally is like the what's the phrase, cognitive behavioral therapy is like the opposite of nurturing offenses, right? It's about overcoming your trauma and seeing yourself as stronger, and realizing that you are capable of more than what you thought before, right? So I think in that sense, the whole like being offended by stuff is counterproductive for yourself, but at the same time, externally and as a form of social capital, people can make these claims and other people support them in their claim of victimhood, or however you'd prefer to phrase that in a more generous way. But like, I think that tension and that motivation is something that I at least on some level, there's more and more of that, I think, on the right wing, in terms of like the more mainstream conservative types. They're all like ready to cry over Dr. Seuss was the thing last week. The week before it was something else.
Mr.
But like,
Potato
they
Head.
make a big deal. Oh yes, exactly. Yes. The week before was Mr. Potato Head. A couple months ago was Aunt Jemima. But it's like they make a big deal out of it because it's like it's their attempt to play the culture war. Right? I think like the social capital, the battle between social capital is the culture war.
Right. And that's the thing. Like, I wasn't offended by that stuff either. I was just like, okay,
but
like,
I think
whatever. This stuff literally, and like, I like what you said. Like, I think it is a fear thing too. Like, people are afraid for some reason that like we can't win this battle of ideas. Like, to me, I like the idea that someone who has libertarian leanings and sympathies coming into the caucus, coming into the party, coming into the movement, and if they have bad ideas, engage them in those bad ideas. Like, win the battle of ideas with them. You don't win the battle of ideas. You don't change the culture by like clutching your pearls and being offended because people have bad ideas. Like, that doesn't help the problem. And like, do I view Hotep's views as problematic to a point? Like, sure, but okay, they're problematic. If clutching our pearls and being offended at racism was going to end racism, like, like, I don't see any evidence for that. Like racism still exists, even while we have a giant, massive media structure that is extremely, like loud about how anti-racist they are. If anything, I think it creates the opposite effect.
Absolutely.
It almost
Yep.
emboldens a counter identity politics where people become like, well, they're so upset because we're right and they're trying to silence us, and it creates this reactionary stuff. And it's
I think, but also on the other side of it, it promotes the claims of racism, and it promotes like the shutting down of any of discussion. And on a more extreme level, it promotes the kind of stuff that the whole Jussie Smollett guy did, right? Like it presents this incentive to become a victim of this societal problem. And to me, the biggest examples of systemic racism are, explicit public policies that disproportionately impact people of different demographic groups. And there are obvious examples, but that's never what's talked about as systemic racism in the broader conversation. It's so much more about no one's saying Social Security is an obvious example of systemic racism.
I had this exact conversation with the Fakertarians when I was on their podcast, because they were like, well, Heiss is saying on Facebook that systemic racism doesn't exist. And I was like, well, Heiss is talking about systemic racism like what Black Lives Matter and the Democratic left right now are talking about. And the way the left talks about systemic racism, I kind of agree that it largely doesn't exist, because they just kind of look at any disparity, like look at all these disparities. That's racist. Look at, you know what I mean? Like, and oh, well, blacks are a minority. It's like the post-structuralist argument where it's like, well, the world is just competing groups of power and blacks are in the minority. We live in a country, in a system, in a culture of white supremacy. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's nonsense. Like, but libertarians make beautiful, well-reasoned, legitimate and evidenced arguments for actual examples of systemic racism. I'll tell you the biggest one: gun control. Gun control is one of the biggest forms of systemic racism and sexism in our culture.
Sure.
But no one wants to talk about that.
Anti-poor people. Yeah.
Right. And I guarantee if I had Heiss on here and said, "Is that systemic racism?" he'd go, "Yeah." Like,
well, sure.
So
I think, I defining the terms is always a challenge, especially when you're dealing with people from different perspectives who use these terms in different ways. It makes it very difficult if we're trying to translate what they say into our lingo, and it gets lost in translation.
Yeah.
But I think the idea that what we need to do is talk about race more is so weird to me, and I find it so discouraging to think like I remember when I was 18, 19, maybe 20, 21 and stuff, and playing basketball, that there are many times like a lot of times when I see these white people talking about their privilege on Twitter and stuff, or Facebook or whatever, and it's like these people that I just almost automatically assume that if they think that white people have all this power and white people are like privilege or power or however they prefer, they usually don't say white power, they say white supremacy or their own white privilege. But to me, like, all they're doing is describing that their view is that white people have power and people of color, which is a very strange phrase that I think will die in the next few years. I'm very optimistic about that too. It's such a just toxic and weird phrase that never existed before because there's no need for it. Like this idea of the dividing people into the whites and the rest of it's just very strange to me. But anyway, the idea that that talking about race more makes racism go away is so backwards to me. And I think treating people as individuals is the ultimate anti-racism. That's the anti-collectivist. Like, racism is just a primitive form of collectivism. And America is so weird about race. And I think America is, in from my perspective at least, it seems like it's an anomaly. Like, European countries don't have this sort of weird, like, people of color versus the white people kind of paradigm that they talk about. And it's I mean, in my experience, like growing up around a lot of black people, I've been, one white person on a basketball court with 9 black dudes, a bunch of times. And I remember when I was younger, like what I was going to say before is, they at times they would say, get, guard red shorts or something. They wouldn't call me the white guy at times because it was kind of like cliche. You know, you don't really like, you wouldn't talk about people just in terms of their skin color like that. And I, you know, obviously it was obvious that I was the white guy at times. And, you know, there are other times where, plenty of times where I was, you know, the minority on a basketball court. And I've been around a lot of black people. I've heard black people say some racist stuff before, for sure. I've heard lots of people, you know, say racist stuff, but just the idea that like we group these, or like that the way that the societal discussion is going is becoming more and more just ridiculous. And it's tragic. And these people with these, to me, like it's about anti-racialism. Make the racial component of it the smaller component. Treat people as individuals. And so the pro-racialists are all using the white privilege and people of color and all of those sorts of narratives. And like, to me, like there's true elements of any of their claims. Like to some degree, I would say anybody who makes those sorts of claims and paints the world, you know, in that sort of, you know, tone, that there's some validity to their claims because the government has been screwing with people for a long time, and they've screwed with people with less power even harder. And they continue to do that. So I think, you know, we don't want to minimize that dynamic. We just want to point it all at the state is the violent oppressor, not the source of, you know, creating some better future society where everybody has all of their needs provided for. So trying to change that dynamic and also talk about race in a way that doesn't like minimize the actual historical context is very challenging. But I just so often I'm just struck by how, my perspective at least, it seems like so many people who talk so boldly about their white privilege, they're literally just saying that white people have like more power, and yet they're against it's weird. It's like they're making the argument that white supremacy exists and they're not white supremacists. But I don't really know why. Their arguments sound just like the white supremacists would if those people existed, which I guess they do, but I don't see that part of the world.
Well,
so
yeah,
it's strange. It's sad though. I think really those are the people I feel the worst for, are the people who are preaching ideas that in 30, 40 years, or 20 years, hopefully, that, you know, people like the white fragility lady,
God,
and other, you know, of those sorts
did you read
of
that
things.
book?
No, of course not. No, I couldn't do it. I've heard her speak before. I mean, I watched a couple, you know, clips and a longer video of her once. And I mean, like, maybe there's some benefit there. You know, maybe there's some utility that somebody can get out of it. But I think so much of it is so collectivist, and it's so reductionist, and it's so judgmental. And then so all of those reasons make it like those reasons right there make it not being a student, right? A lot of times those people use the phrase like, we got to do the work. And what that means is just submit to what we say.
Like I view the people that go so far that they like call everything the culture of white supremacy. I view those people as wrong and problematic as when guys like Hotep say, you know, dumb collectivist things about Jews.
I would say it's actually way, way worse.
Well, I think
those people, Hotep doesn't have a huge following. Hotep isn't on CNN, you know, spouting his racist stuff.
I mean,
but these other people are. These people have huge positions. They're leaders of the biggest colleges in the country, of the biggest companies. There's stuff that Google puts out all the time. I mean, it's stuff that I just it's really weird.
I mean,
it's exactly the opposite of Martin Luther King. That's the thing that gets me is, you know, don't judge people by the color of the skin, by the content of their character. And this, the whole, their whole narrative is exactly the anti-racist narrative is the opposite of that. And that's terrible.
Yeah. The Holocaust stuff and things Hotep says, I think they just get taken, like people are very commonly like, they view the Holocaust and Nazi Germany as like the worst things that have happened in history. I agree with that. I'm trying to remember his name. Jordan Peterson had a conversation once with Sam Harris and I'm blanking.
Douglas Murray.
Douglas Murray. That's the other one. Yes. Yeah. And Douglas Murray once said, like, we're living in what history will call the post-Holocaust, the post-World War II era. And like one of the things he said in that conversation was like, there's like the one thing that we like everybody agrees that we don't want to be is the Nazis. And I think it's true. Like a lot of people, like, especially when people like they've this is something I see as a Christian. Like when you take off the Christian worldview and you reject Christian morality, well, like because humans act you are still going to have a religion and a system of morality. Like you can't help it. Like this is something you and I talked about the last time. Like people
Well, you
always
have to have a system of subjective values that you
right,
compare
exactly.
to each other and measure. Yeah.
And so what the culture on the left has seemingly done is like create this really like half-assed, like very loosely congregated set of like of moral values, and at the top of their hierarchy is Nazis are bad. And it's like it's how they view their entire worldview, which is like, and it's not that it's wrong to say Nazis are bad, but like when you've reduced your entire moral worldview to just like almost primarily being about that, I think that it just creates these weird pathologies where you react to people and you react to racism and bigotry in ways that just aren't helpful, that don't actually that are counterproductive. And I really like I'm sorry, like people, this is one of the things that people have laughed at me about in like those groups, but I just think it's spot on. I really think that the rise of the alt-right and the white identity politics that you've seen is the result of the identity politics the left has played over the past decade. Like I really think that they are.
Is there really a movement though of like racist white people gaining political power? Maybe in Europe, maybe in like Eastern Europe, I guess there's some.
Yeah, I mean like a little bit in Europe, like with Brexit and stuff, you could say.
Are you talking about the lady, the congresswoman from Georgia? Oh, God. I guess she's kind of out there. I don't really know what.
I don't think the alt-right is a huge problem, but insofar as the alt-right is in existence, or like I was having this conversation the other day, like I don't think the alt-right really exists as like a large group of people, but it is kind of like a cultural reactionary tendency that you do see different shades of on the right. And I think to the extent that that exists and that some people get caught up in that and radicalized in that, the left is only making that worse and not better. Well, I think, so and that's what I've tried to encourage them, is to be like, it's not that I like Nazism, it's not that I like for example the things that Hotep says, but what is going to help, like let's say like let's focus on Hotep again here. What's going to help him to like become better as a person? Is it going to be that he comes into libertarian circles and engages with people who have better ideas and that engage him in good faith, or if people just shriek at him from afar and say, "You Nazi racist piece of shit," and keep him at arm's length? Like what? Like that just, and I think, and that's why even though I've had reservations, it's not reservations like saying let's not talk to him. It's just kind of been like, I think the problem is, and this is the other thing that we should talk a bit about here at the end, is that we also have to be careful, I think, you know, on our side, the Mises crowd, is that we do have to be careful to not be reactionary ourselves towards our critics, which is like not to just take every criticism and to you know, brush it off as like, well, it's just the loser brigade being irrational or being ridiculous. Like I've seen that tendency a little bit, and I think we have to pump the brakes a little bit on that, in my opinion, which is not to say that we should go through our lives and like try to appease the everyone on in that crowd. Yeah. But like we have to recognize that like just because some of them operate in bad faith and never react doesn't mean that there aren't good, bad, and you know then conversely really bad and then better ways of going about these things. And for me it's kind of been about like a praxeological thing, which is like, well, you know, our goal is X, so let's come up with the best ways of getting there. If our goal is we want a guy like Hotep, we want to bring him on and, you know, have him be part of the liberty movement, like that's fine, but like let's do that in the best way possible. And I feel like we've just, the way that it happened was rushed and a bit clumsy, and that probably didn't help. And I think that, you know, just because there are people who are insane about being anti-racists and anti-bigoted doesn't mean that we should just casually be desensitized to racism and bigotry. Like I think racism and bigotry are bad, but it's just
Sure.
just because overreacting to it like the left does or the loser brigade does is bad. And I say that just to, I don't know, fakertarians, loser. I don't know what to call them other than what people have started calling them. It's not my favorite term to use for them.
Yeah.
But like, just because they overreact to it doesn't mean that we should just not react to it. And I think that's been like kind of like what I've been pointing out, which is like there are degrees to this here. Like we can, and to me, it's just as simple as saying we like that Hotep's an anarchist. Yeah, I don't like when he says that the Holocaust didn't happen. I think that's wrong and stupid. Like, and that's it. Like, it's not hard. You know,
it's something he said once. I've heard him interviewed a couple times. He was very reasonable, pretty funny, pretty entertaining, character. Had, some kind of, I don't think black nationalism is the right word, but I'm not really sure.
It's
maybe black identitarianism.
Yeah, perhaps. Black identitarianism. But
like,
is
I think,
the thing.
Yeah. And I think he whatever. That's fine. Lots of black people are proud and happy to be black. They don't see it as some like badge of grievance or something, or at least black people that I grew up with and stuff. And I think the idea that you had said earlier about like Nazis are the worst, and Douglas Murray's point about that. And I think if I remember correctly, Douglas then went on to say, and communism didn't get that same rap. It just wasn't as obvious to people, right?
Right.
And even though communism killed, way more people than fascism in the 20th century, or like the communist states did, to me, like the Nazis are such a useful example to point at the problems of both the left and the right, of the problems of nationalism and how, hyper-nationalism and ethno-nationalism are very, very dangerous collectivist ideas that allow people to completely, violate any, normal sense of morality. And then on the other side of it, the socialism side of having, the sort of bureaucratic control that the party had over so much of the society. And even though, one thing I learned from some more lefty types was that the word privatization was what the Nazis used, but it wasn't really in any real sense of how we would think of privatization now. Right. It was just about kind of shifting it so that the profits could be somewhat moved and, just used more flexibly than within the party system. And it was a terrible, the worst of both the left and the right. And they converged into being, the worst. And everyone notices that it's the worst.
It was like,
and everyone on the right says it's socialism. And the people on the left say the Nazis were nationalists. Right. So everyone wants to point, or at least the normal like left right narrative, they want to say the Nazis are on the other team. Like this sort of Dinesh D'Souza version of the argument says that they're leftists, and then whatever on the left would say that they're right wing, obviously. And I think it's the worst of both worlds. And so, but I think libertarians often see the worst of the left and the right. And so that's why the Nazis were so obvious, whereas the communists always had that social justice message. They were killing people because of equality. The equality stuff is always at the center of the communist rhetoric. And I think the phrase cultural Marxism definitely seems more relevant now. I guess it's kind of a pejorative and it's a euphemism for that other people use in whatever ways, but I think it's certainly a useful term in terms of dividing people into groups. Like to me, the phrase people of color, that's cultural Marxism, at least the way that I view it, that's what I think of as cultural Marxism, in the sense of divide people into groups, pit them against each other to have the revolution to shift the power structure. And on some level, there's good to that argument, right? We need to have a shift in power away from the powerful elites, except it's not like the elites as some, the bougie, just people generally. It's the law enforcement apparatus, the welfare warfare state, right? So I think, but I guess to go back to your point about Hotep, the one thing that I would just say in the context of your argument, like I agree with where you're coming from. I think it's an important conversation to have, especially within the Mises Caucus. But I think there also has to be we have to address the question of like, what is the goal? Like, are we a big tent organization? And I guess to some degree, having him at a California event is a slightly different question, because that is, showing him as a part of the leadership, I guess, depending on how you're phrasing the event, right? If it's like have him as a part of a panel to have an interesting discussion, that's one thing, versus like giving a lecture on some, like, you know what I mean? Like that part of it just kind of depends. But I think the idea that we want to bring people into our team and someone who I'm pretty sure he said he didn't vote, doesn't vote, thinks voting is basically stupid or pointless or, complicit in the system. And I think if someone like that is interested in being a part of the Libertarian Party, we should, give him a big hug and say, hey, bro, stop saying stupid stuff, and explain, okay, here's like, some evidence, right? But the first step is welcome and love and yes,
right.
and yeah, glad you're here. Let's talk about other stuff. What other things do we agree with? You know what I mean? Rather than trying to be gatekeepers. Like and that phrase, I know you didn't like when I mentioned that phrase, but I do think like that's the idea of it. Yeah,
I don't like gatekeeping, and that was definitely not ever what I was trying to do. And I've tried to be clear. It's like it was only to I wanted to, because it's just.
Well, and one other thing I just wanted to add there is that the to me, to go back to the idea of praxeology and the study of human action, it's also treating people as though they are students. And I think if you believe that your ideas are correct and sustainable and they win the argument, then you're not as fearful of the bigoted ideas that other people might have, because you view them as students who are just trying to figure it out, right? Like if we're all just here as people trying to figure out how to live our lives, how to act in ways that allow us to, pursue our ends, that if you, treat other people with that mindset, then you're guaranteed to be, more successful and also have a more accurate view of their ability to learn, rather than being condescending or rejecting or intolerant of people. It's just a different form of bigotry. Maybe that's not the best way to put it, but to me, like being anti-Hotep because he had a few bad sentences, to me, as long as he, didn't initiate physical violence against other people, it's all just talk. It's all just smack talk.
Right. And I mean,
locker room talk.
Oh God, no, let's not go there.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah. And, my heart is for, I love the Mises Caucus. I want it to succeed. I do want it to be a big tent. I would say some people would also be a little irritated because the caucus might, sometimes outwardly put out a message that's like, it doesn't want to be a big tent. Like it doesn't like the left libertarians. Sure. I'm not sure that is the mentality of the caucus, so that's something that could be talked about too. To me, it's just anybody that is, a good libertarian. And I think that people on the left can be good libertarians. Like I want to be allied with them. I think the reason why people get concerned with the Mises Caucus is because they like, we don't have in our platforms things about immigration, and we don't have things in our platform about bigotry, and people say like, why did you leave those out? And
there's an identity politics thing.
Yeah, there is a thing about identity politics, which to me is fine.
Yeah, it's okay.
And whatnot. So, but yeah, I mean, my heart is for the liberty movement to succeed, and the only way that happens is that we have to stop fighting each other and fight the state. I
have many different views from the Mises Caucus. I mean, for one, like I don't think end of Fed is an interesting argument. I'm for it, I guess, but I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it really makes that much sense to argue for it, because it's fiat currency. They control it. They made it up. They print whenever they want, and just even engaging in that argument just isn't worth. Like, it's not our dollar; it's the U.S. dollar. Right. And I don't know. I just think sometimes with the way that the monetary policy stuff is discussed within Mises Caucus, and it's like, it's not that I disagree with any of the, Mises theory of property and credit, or theory of money and credit argument. I agree with all of it. I just think that's not relevant anymore. Like, you can't have that much debt on the balance sheet in the way that they have the and also the MMT argument, which I don't know if we ever talked about, but like modern monetary theory and the idea of like the way that those people view the monetary system, to me, makes a lot of sense. And their solutions are terrible. Like, their actual public policy is horrible, but the way that they describe the monetary system, just in the descriptive sense, is perfectly useful and accurate.
I think the focus the focus on the Fed is just to draw attention to the fact that it is the source of power by which the state is able to commit its worst atrocities. Like, without the monetary policy of the Fed, you couldn't have the endless wars. You really couldn't have the expansive power of the police state. You couldn't have the expansive power of the immigration control we have,
the student loan system,
or the student loan system.
1.6 trillion.
So it's
exactly.
So it's important to point out, I think, but it's probably not the first conversation you should have with people.
No, I think it's way down the line. Yeah. I think there are so many other more obvious atrocities that the government commits,
right?
Ways that it hurts people so much more directly that we don't need to go to that. And honestly, like, just from my over the last year or so, my view on just the way to talk and think about what the monetary system is has shifted. Not that I disagree with the Mises claim, just that I don't think it's really relevant to what the dollar is as a fiat currency today. It's a completely losing battle. Whereas we could stop gun control, we could stop the killer clock change of or make daylight savings permanent, and actually have political progress towards a more peaceful and prosperous society, by focusing on issues that actually we might actually be able to win and change some opinions on. So I think that's got to be the goal, and that's a perfect way to think about it as the means and ends, right? Like, how can we actually use ourselves as a means to actually accomplish something to reduce the violent ends of the state.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, my friend, it's been fun. Was glad to have you on again, and we'll definitely do this again sometime. So yeah, thanks for coming on and hashing all these things out with me. It was I got a lot out of it. Every time, this is the second time we've talked. We've also talked privately. Every time we do, I feel like I learn a little bit and get a better understanding of the world and a way to, align my personal philosophy and stuff to work better and to make it, to alter my praxis a little bit to make it more effective. So I appreciate the conversation and look forward to having it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely, man. This is a lot of fun. Great
job. All right, man. Have a good night.
You too.
Bye.